Welcome back to Reading Rendezvous. Today, I'm sharing a January reading wrap-up of all the books I read this month. It was a mix of classics and more recent fiction. Some were heavy, some were familiar, and some were just nice to spend time with. Let's get into it. I started January with Dracula, but I'll keep this one brief since we already covered it in a full episode. At its core, Dracula is a Gothic novel told through letters, journal entries, and newspaper clippings. It follows a small group of people slowly realizing that something unnatural is happening, even though none of them has the full picture at once. For me, this novel was not really what I expected. The horror is quite subtle, and a lot of the tension comes from what it isn't said rather than what it is. So if you're expecting something fast-paced or action-heavy, this book might surprise you. If you want the full discussion and what worked for me, what didn't, and why I think Mina is far more capable than she's often treated, the dedicated episode is already up. After Dracula, I picked a book called A Little Life. I actually came across this book while doom scrolling. I can't remember who posted the reel, but it was someone crying their eyes out while reading it. And that alone made me wonder what this book was really about. But before I talk about how I cried my eyes out almost the entire book, let's start with what it's about. And if you haven't read it yet, this is your spoiler warning. A Little Life follows the life of 4 friends, Jude, William, JB, and Malcolm, over several decades, starting in their early adulthood and continuing through their careers, relationship, and personal lives. While it begins as a story about friendship and ambition, the focus gradually shifts to Jude and his past, which is deeply heartbreaking. And as the novel unfolds, it explores trauma, chronic pain, self-worth, and the long-term impact of abuse. This isn't a plot-driven book in the traditional sense. It's much more about interior lives and relationships, and about how the past never really stays in the past. And just to be clear, this is not a book with a happy ending. It doesn't happen, so go in prepared. Now, with that out of the way, let's move on to what I thought about it. First of all, this was a very heavy read, but not in a dramatic or sensational way. Yes, there are chapters that are genuinely difficult to get through, but I think what affected me the most was how constant the emotional pain is throughout the book. One of the strongest feelings I had while reading was that there's no real pause, no moment where the story fully lets you breathe. The tragedy isn't built around a handful of shocking events meant to move the plot forward. Instead, it's written into every stage of the 4 characters' lives. The book doesn't offer relief or easy resolution to their problems, and for me, that consistency is what made it so emotionally draining. There were many moments where I needed to stop and take a break, to step back into the real world and remind myself that this is a book, that these are not real-life friends going through this, and that everything is okay. The writing is exceptional in how it makes you feel like these are people you know, moving through life with both the good and the bad. I think this is the type of book that you need to fully read to grasp all the details, emotions, and the way the story and characters are developed. I don't think skimming through the main chapters would do it justice. But I do want to share 3 main moments in the book that broke my heart, and one in particular that made me appreciate the life I have even more. The first moment is when Jude finally gets to be part of a family, when he is adopted, even at an old age, 33 I believe, by his former teacher and mentor, Harold, and his wife, Julia. That moment and that development felt like a rare positive turn in the middle of all the horrible events that kept happening. After all of Jude's suffering, the pain, the self-harm, the inability to open up to his close friends about his past, it felt deserved, like a brief respite. I also liked how Jude's character was written during this time. Even with all that affection, even simple gestures like physical touch were difficult for him. And yet, he tried. At the same time, even though this was a happy event, the book quickly brings you back down to reality. That comes through Jude's doubts before the adoption, his fear that once Harold and Julia learned about his past or what he'd been through, they wouldn't accept him, that he was somehow damaged, that he wasn't the perfect son they deserved, and how all of this fed into his self-worth and continued self-harm. That was probably the moment when I realized this book wasn't going to soften things or fluff anything up. It was going to stay as close to reality as life usually is. The second moment in the book, and the hardest to read for me, was Jude's relationship with Caleb. I had to put the book down multiple times during those chapters because they were horrific to read. If I'm honest, there were moments when I felt the writing was almost too brutal. I'm not oblivious. Of course, I know domestic abuse exists in real life and that relationships like that do happen. But it was incredibly hard to read. At one point, and this isn't something I usually do, I had to look up whether that relationship would end. I needed to know that it would end. Those chapters felt like living through hell alongside the character. And I hated Caleb with everything I had, even though he's fictional. And again, that just comes back to how powerful the writing is, that it makes you live through everything with the characters. Before I move on to the last part that I found extremely impactful, I want to talk a little bit about the other main characters in the book. Although the story ultimately centers on Jude, I really liked how, especially at the beginning, each of the other three friends had their own chapters and backstories. Throughout the book, their lives continued to develop alongside Jude's. They all experienced both good and bad, addiction, career failures, family loss, but also moments of happiness. The four of them function as a unit, supporting one another through every stage of their life and everything they go through. And to me, that felt like a very honest depiction of real-life friendship. You can be incredibly close during certain periods. Then life shifts. People change, you grow, your friends grow, and then you find your way back to each other. It felt very real. Now, the last part of the book, the part that made me cry even more than I already had, came surprisingly not right at the end, but just before it. That moment was the sudden death of Willem, who was by then in a long-term loving relationship with Jude, and the death of Malcolm, their other close friend, along with Malcolm's wife. I can't fully explain how much this broke my heart. Maybe because the deaths were so sudden in a tragic car accident, and then it's just done, all gone. It forced me to think about real life, about how one day the person you love could just be gone, and there's nothing you can do about it. Obviously, you can't live your life constantly thinking that way about your partner or family or friends. But reading it, the way it was written, the emotions, the aftermath, and seeing how Jude was left completely lost, it struck a nerve. It made me deeply sad. And then, of course, there's the ending of the book, which, if you haven't read it yet, I won't spell it out, but it's not a they lived happily ever after ending. When I finished this book, I genuinely needed a few days to stop thinking about it. It's exceptional and I would highly recommend it, but only if you're okay with potentially being emotionally affected by what you're reading. After finishing, I also looked around to see how other people felt about the book. And unsurprisingly, opinions are extremely mixed. The general consensus seemed to be that the book is unforgettable or even life-changing, but almost always with a warning attached. Some readers feel the book goes too far and becomes emotionally overwhelming, while others argue that the repetition reflects the reality of unresolved trauma. And I tend to agree with that. One thing that comes up again and again is that this isn't a book people casually recommend. Even readers who love it usually say you need to be in the right headspace, which, again, I agree with. For me, I'm glad I read it, but it's not a book I see myself revisiting. I don't think I could go through that heartache again. After I finished A Little Life, I knew I needed something very different. I needed to step away from the emotional heaviness and move into something more familiar, let's say. Maybe a classic fiction rather than emotional devastation. So the third book I read in January was Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, specifically the 4 main novels: A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of the Four, The Hound of the Baskervilles, and The Valley of Fear. First, let's start with a short description of these 4 stories, as most of us have probably heard, read, or seen through films and TV adaptations the plot of the stories. The Sherlock Holmes stories follow consulting detective Sherlock Holmes and his companion, Dr. John Watson, as they investigate crimes in Victorian London. The 4 stories I read are part of the Complete Novels and Stories, Volume 1. There is also a second book with 56 shorter stories. Each case is built around observation, deduction, and logical reasoning, and most of the stories are told from Watson's point of view. These are very structured mysteries, and there's always a puzzle, a trail of clues, and a resolution. Now, briefly, the 4 novels. A Study in Scarlet introduces both Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. The story begins as a murder mystery in London, but expands into a long backstory set in the American West, explaining the motive behind the crime. It's as much an origin story of Sherlock and Dr. Watson as it is a mystery. The Sign of Four centers around a stolen treasure and a murder linked to events in colonial India. This one leans heavily into adventure, secret histories, and hidden motives, while also developing Watson's personal life a little more. The Hound of Baskervilles is probably the most famous of the 4 and my personal favorite, and follows Sherlock Holmes and Watson as they investigate a supposedly supernatural hound hunting a family in the foggy Dartmoor moors. Plays with gothic horror, but ultimately brings everything back into logic and reason. I loved this one. The Valley of Fear begins with a murder investigation, but then shifts into a long, detailed backstory involving secret societies and betrayal. It's darker in tone and feels more political than the others. For me, Sherlock Holmes felt like a reset. It was such a relief to step into a world where problems are meant to be solved, where there's a sense of order, and where, by the end, things usually make sense. And after a week of reading a little life and sitting with emotional weight, it was genuinely comforting to follow these stories and get lost in this world. I think I really enjoyed the less emotion of it, if that makes sense. It felt like problem solving, a bit of mystery, some crazy hounds with luminescent pain. Oops, spoiler alert. And not much romance. Or at least not more than what was probably acceptable to write at that time. There is one thing about these stories, though, that really took me by surprise. I've seen the films and the TV adaptations, which are, of course, based on the books. But I felt like the problem solving in the adaptations is portrayed as far more dramatic than it actually is in the books. In the books, it feels much more grounded, let's say. Yes, Holmes solves things because of a footprint or whatever else, but it's not always some wildly out of the ordinary leap. Sometimes it even makes you think, how did I not see that? It's obvious and it's right there in front of you. But in the films, it often feels more exaggerated, like you'd need 5 brains and to read 25 books a day to reach the same conclusions. I felt like the books showed Sherlock's natural skill of deduction far more clearly than the adaptations do. And that actually reminded me of the feeling I had whilst reading Dracula and the difference between the book and the movie adaptation. Overall, Sherlock Holmes was the perfect palate cleanser for me. It didn't ask for much emotional endurance, just attention. And even if you've already seen the films, I'd still highly recommend reading the books. They're such a good read. Now to the last book I read in January, and that was Alchemised. And honestly, I loved it. Like, really loved it. The world, the pacing, the characters, everything just clicked for me, even though it's quite graphic and descriptive at times. For me, it was easily one of the best fantasy books I've ever read. And that's not something I say lightly. Nothing will ever beat The Lord of the Rings for me. But aside from that, this one came very, very close. I think what really surprised me was how I couldn't put this book down from the moment I picked it up. This is a 1,000 plus page book, and I think I read it in about 4 days. And keep in mind, I don't read all day, just during my commute to work and in the evenings during the week. It's the kind of book that pulls you in quickly and doesn't let go. I actually found myself thinking about the characters and that world when I wasn't reading, wanting to get back to it and genuinely missing it once I finished, which for me is always a sign that a book has done something right. And because I loved it so much, I don't think it's fair to rush through it here. Alchemised deserves its own full episode, where I can properly talk about the story, the characters, and why it worked so well for me, without holding back. And in that episode, I'll also be covering Manacled, the Harry Potter fanfiction which later inspired Alchemised, and which I somehow managed to squeeze in right after finishing this book. I told you I couldn't get enough. So for now, I'll keep this brief. Just note that Alchemised completely took me by surprise and ended January on a very high note. A full dedicated episode is definitely coming. Overall, January was a really mixed reading month for me. Some books were heavy, some felt familiar and comforting, and others were just fun to get lost in. It felt like a good way to start the year, with a bit of everything. That brings us to the end of this January reading wrap-up. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you could leave a rating or a review, as it really helps the show reach more readers. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on any of the books I mentioned or any recommendations you might have. You can reach out via social media. I'd really love to make this as interactive as possible. Happy reading, and I'll see you in the next episode.